So today I've decided to build my own webmail client, and the goal of this video is to show you how you can implement such a tool to send and receive emails and also manipulate existing inboxes. Obviously, this is going to be a very raw and very basic version of a webmail client, missing tons of features, but for the sake of this video, I think it will do nicely. So by the end of this video, we will be able to authenticate into any existing mailbox which supports IMAP and SMTP, and we're gonna be able to view, edit and delete messages freely, and obviously we will be able to switch between accounts to send messages from one account to the other. Now to achieve that, we will need to complete 3 steps. First, we will install a local email server onto our machine. Next, we will need to set up a backend server to communicate with our email server. And lastly, we will be building a front end to interface with our backend. Now for the email server, we're going to be using Mercury, which comes with XAMPP. For the backend server, we're going to be using Node.js and Express. And for the front end, we're going to be using Angular. Before we jump into the video, I wanted to highlight that this is not a step-by-step tutorial, rather this is a high-level overview of the code and the process of sending and receiving email with IMAP and SMTP. Having that said, I will not be covering in depth the HTML and CSS parts of the client, and I will be skipping over things that are not relevant to the project itself. I highly encourage you to download the project files from the description below so that you can follow along with the video. So let's take a moment to analyze how everything works. So to begin with, our Angular application will communicate with our backend server to either send or fetch emails and perform other actions on our mailboxes. On the other hand, the backend server will communicate with our SMTP and IMAP servers to send emails and fetch emails. Now, the SMTP server is essentially used to send emails, meaning that we're using the SMTP protocol under the hood to send an email to our server. And then the IMAP server is used to fetch emails which already exist on the server. Now, as you can see here, I have included both IMAP and POP in this example, but in our case, we're going to be using IMAP. Now, the IMAP protocol allows you to view the same message on our server from multiple devices. This means that if multiple devices connect to the same server, all of the emails will be synchronized and every device will be able to see that email. On the other hand, with a POP server, if you fetch an email on a single device, the email stops existing on the server, meaning that it is deleted from the server once the device fetches that email. This means that if a different device connects to the POP server later on, it won't be able to see that email anymore. So in our case, we're going to be using the IMAP protocol and we're going to be using the corresponding IMAP server. Now, both the SMTP and the IMAP server will be run by Mercury. So this means that after we set up Mercury, these two servers will exist on our machine. Now, we will be able to use our client-server architecture later on to interface with any email server, even if it's your Gmail server, to both send and receive emails, but for the sake of this video, we want a local email server, and that's why we're using Mercury and the corresponding SMTP and IMAP servers. So the first step would be to set up our local email server, and to do that we will need to download XAMPP, and then we will need to go ahead and activate Mercury. So just click Start in the Actions section, and then we want to open up the admin panel. And from here, we can go into Configuration, Manage Local Users, and now we can add our own users. For this example, I'm going to be using Alice and Bob as our users, but if you want to add your own user, you can go ahead and click on Add. And here you want to add a username, so let's call this user Joe. And then you can give the user a personal name, and actually just make sure that the username is lowercase. And then for the password, you can set pretty much anything, and I'm just gonna go with 1234, and I'm just gonna click OK. And our user has been successfully added. And after this is done, we can close this window. Don't close Mercury, just minimize it, otherwise it will stop the process. And now we want to download Mozilla Thunderbird to ensure that everything works correctly. And inside your Thunderbird client, you can see here that we have our users available. So each user has an inbox, a sent folder, and a trash folder. The send folder is not visible for these two users, but it exists. And then if we want to add a new user, we can go up here, we can click on new account, existing email, and in here just give your username. And then for the email address, you want the username, append it with @ and then localhost. And for the password, you're just using the password that we've just created. So in my case, it's 1234. And now we can click continue. And now we can click on done. This gives us a warning because everything runs on localhost, so it is not secure. We can click on I understand the risks, and we can click on confirm. And as you can see here, the user has been successfully added, and we can see the inbox with a sample message and also the trash folder. Now, you ideally want to also have a sent folder, and just to make sure that it exists, we can right click on the inbox. We can go to new folder and we can just type send. And with that, we can click on create folder and the folder has been created for us. So we just want to make sure that these three folders exist and the names of these folders are important because we're going to be using them to fetch our folders in our Webmail client. And with that, we're pretty much done and we can just simply close the Thunderbird client as we won't be using it anymore. On the backend side of things, we're going to be using Node.js and Express to set up our server, and then we're going to be using the Node Mailer package to send our emails using SMTP, and then we're going to be making use of the IMAP package to receive our emails and manage our inboxes. I also recommend reading through the official documentation on the NPM page, since the package itself is pretty complicated. To create our backend server, we begin with the entry point to our Node.js and Express application, which is the server.js file. Our server will allow us to send, receive, and manage emails, and we can achieve this by utilizing the Node Mailer and IMAP packages. Now down here, we're creating an instance of the server. We're using the corresponding middleware to parse bodies and allow connections. And then we are essentially creating our routes here, and by accessing those routes we can perform certain actions such as sending email, marking email as read or unread, and getting our emails. So beyond those, we also have functions to log out, log in, and check whether the user is logged in. Now, every single time the user is trying to access one of these routes, they need to pass through the authentication middleware. Now, the authentication middleware is pretty simple. It attempts to extract the user credentials from a header which is sent from the front end, and then these credentials are parsed by using the basic auth package to extract them as name and password, and then we're attempting to get an instance of a IMAP and transporter objects, and if those objects do not exist, we create such an instance by using our username and password as configuration parameters. If everything has been successful, we're appending our credentials to the request, and then we're proceeding into the endpoint. Now, the way that the IMAP auth and Node Mailer auth functions work is very simple. If we go into our auth methods file here, you can see here we have a couple of methods, and we begin by creating two instances of our objects. So our IMAP object is null and our transporter object is null by default. Then we have a function which simply returns our transporter if necessary, and we also have a function which returns our IMAP object if necessary as well. Also here you can see that if we are connected to an inbox, so if there is an open connection, then we're closing the box before returning the IMAP object. Essentially, these functions are called when we want to retrieve instances of our objects, and whenever we call these functions, we want to make sure that we reset everything that needs to be reset. So in the case of the transporter, there is nothing to reset, but with the IMAP, we are closing any currently open inboxes just in case. Now, next up, we have the function which is used to instantiate our transporter. So we're using the Node Mailer package here. We're providing our local IP as the service on port 25, and we're setting secure to false. And then in here, we are providing our credentials. and then this essentially creates an instance of the transporter. Next up, we have the IMAP connect function, which returns a promise. So essentially, it creates a new instance of the IMAP object with the provided configuration, and then it tries to create a connection. Now, once the connection is ready, we receive a callback, and if there has been an error, we also receive a different callback. Now, down below, we have the IMAP auth function, which terminates any existing IMAP connection. So basically, once we attempt to call this function, the existing connection will be terminated. Then we have a configuration with our credentials and TLS set to false. And then we're saying that IMAP is equal to await IMAP connect with the provided configuration. So then our IMAP connect function is being called, and since this is a promise, it will wait for the promise to resolve before instantiating this object, so before assigning this new instance to our IMAP object. And with that said, we also have the login function, and in here we're just checking if IMAP is currently instantiated, and if it is, we're terminating the connection and setting IMAP to null. And we're doing pretty much the same thing with our transporter. We're closing the transporter, and then we're setting it to null. So this is how our authentication methods work. And now we can look at the actual routes. So let's begin with the send email route. And in here, we're essentially getting the properties of the message that we want to send from the front end. Then we're getting the user credentials from our authentication middleware. We're getting the instance of our transporter. We're creating a new configuration for the mail that we want to send. And then we're using the transporter to send the email in question. And then we're closing the connection just in case. So next up, we have the send reply route here. And this is a little bit more complicated. So essentially, we're getting the text of the email and the ID of the message that we're replying to. And down here, we're getting the credentials of the user once again. So we're getting the username through the authentication middleware. We're getting an instance of our IMAP and our transporter objects. And then we're using imap.openbox to open a specific folder. And in this case, the selected folder will either be inbox, send, or trash. And then, once this is successful, we're using imap.sequence.fetch with the ID of our previous message. So we want to fetch the previous message. And basically, we're using imap.sequence.fetch because the ID in question, which again comes from the front end, this ID is a sequential ID, meaning that this ID is something like the index of the message inside of your email box. So this is why you have to use imap.sequence.fetch, and then we provide the ID itself, and then we also provide the fetch options here. Now the fetch options are declared up here, and what we do care about is this field called mark seen, and basically what this does, it ensures that if this is set to false, once we fetch the message, the seen flag is not appended to the message. Now the seen flag lets our backend and our frontend know whether the message has been seen by the user, and since we're simply fetching the message and we're not actually displaying the message to the user, we do not want the message to be marked as seen, and this is why this is set to false. So basically here, again, we're fetching the message, and then we're getting the message, we're getting the body, and then we're getting a stream. Now to parse the stream into a readable object, we need to use simple parser, which is essentially a function from the mail parser package here. And we're using this function to parse our stream. And then we can extract fields from our email like the date, the from text, and the text as HTML here. And then what we do is we create the reply text constant, which is essentially our text appended with the information about the previous email chain. So basically, when you reply to a message, you also want the previous email chain to come along with the reply in question. And then we're also creating a subject, and we want to ensure that the subject starts with the letters RE to indicate that this is a reply, and if it does not, we prepend RE to our subject. And then, again, we're creating a reply configuration here. So we have the from field, the to field, the subject, the HTML, which is a reply text, and then an additional field called in reply to, and then this takes the message ID of the previous email, which we are parsing up here. Now down here we are using the node mailer transporter just like before to send the message, and we're using the configuration which we've created up here to send the message in question. Now once the message is sent, the last part is to ensure that we save a copy of the sent message inside of our sent folder. So basically by default, when we simply send a message, we're doing that using SMTP, and that does nothing to save a copy of the message inside of our sent folder. In fact, the node mailer does not even know that the sent folder exists, and in fact it is taken care of by IMAP in this case. So basically here what we want to do is that once the reply has been sent, we want to save a copy of the sent message inside of our sent folder. So in this case, we're creating a raw copy of the message in a very specific format, which will be accepted by IMAP. And then we're saying IMAP.append to move the copy to a specific inbox, to append the copy to a specific inbox. And then we're saying append, then we're taking our raw message, and then we're specifying that the mailbox is sent. Again, I have to highlight that this is a very basic implementation and it does not even check whether this mailbox exists. So always be very, very careful when using such tutorials to implement an actual real-life project, and this is just simply a demonstration. So with that said, we can move on to the next method, which is mark as unread. So basically here we're simply taking the ID of the message in question, and then again we're getting an instance of IMAP. We're opening the selected inbox, and then down here we're using IMAP.sequence again, since this is a sequential ID, .delete flags to delete an existing flag, and then we're providing the ID and the flag in question. So in this case, the flag is seen. Now, if we go up here again, if we didn't set this to false, the seen flag would be appended automatically every time we fetch a message. So in this case, this is how we mark an email as unread, and similarly to mark an email as read, we are using the add flags function from the same library to add the seen flag. So basically these two functions work in an almost identical way. So with that said, let's move into our get emails function. Now this function gets a folder from the front end, so this is a get request. So basically this is a REST API GET request, while the previous requests were POST requests. And with a GET request, we're looking at the query, while with the POST request, we were looking at the body. But this obviously depends how exactly your front end is sending the information. Now, with that said, here we're getting the folder from the front end, and if it has not been provided, by default, we're assuming that the folder is our inbox folder. And then what we're doing is basically we're creating an instance of IMAP, and then we're getting our boxes. So basically we're getting all of our mailboxes, and then we're trying to match the folder in question with one of our mailboxes to ensure that it actually exists, and if one does not exist, we throw an error. This also ensures that the capitalization does not matter. So with that said, we are setting our selected folder, so our selected folder variable from up here, which we were using before in various functions like this one. We're setting the variable in question to the folder that we've identified. So the get emails endpoint is usually called first, and this way we can obtain the selected folder. Now then we can simply call the openbox function to open the selected folder, and then we need to actually get our emails, and then we need to paginate them. Now the first step is to get the page and page size parameters, which are going to be used for pagination. So in this case, we're saying request.query.page, and in this case, we're saying request.query.pairPage. And again, these come from the front end. And then we're saying imap.search, and by default, imap.search will search inside the currently opened folder. So in this case, we used openbox on our selected folder, and assuming that we're inside of our inbox, this will only search the emails within the inbox. And then once we find all of the messages, they will be returned in the form of our results here, and these are the message IDs. So these are not the complete messages, these are just the IDs of our messages. So basically, after having gotten our IDs, we get the total number of messages, then we calculate the number of total pages by dividing the number of messages by the page size, which we fetched from the front end, and then we need to sort everything to make sure that the latest messages appear first, and then we need to slice the results to only get the section of the results which matches the page that we're requesting. So then in here, we're essentially fetching our messages, and this time we're saying IMAP.fetch, and in here we're providing the array of IDs alongside with our fetch options from before, and then we're creating an array of messages. Then we're gonna be doing fetch on to get each single message, and for each message we are essentially getting the sequence number of that message. So we're creating an object called message, and in here we're saying that ID is equal to sequence number, and then we also have a property called scene and a property called stream. Then from the body of the message, we're extracting the actual stream, which is the body of the message, and we're assigning that to our previously created stream property. And from our attributes, we're checking whether the scene flag is present on the message, and if so, scene will be turned to true, otherwise it will be set to false. And then once this is done, we are pushing the message into the messages array. So this way we're getting all of our messages, and then once this is done, we have to create an array of promises. So basically we're going to go through each message, and for every single message we're going to push a new promise into our promises array. And again, we're using the stream, and we're parsing the stream using our simple parser to get the information from that message. So we're creating an object here called parsed, and then we're creating a new object called email, and then we're creating all of these fields, and we are extracting the corresponding information from either the parsed message or from the message object from before. So basically this allows us to get the from, the subject, the date, the text, the HTML, the to, the ID, and the scene fields, and then that resolves the promise with the email object in question. So then we're using promise.all to wait for all of the promises to be resolved, and once everything has been successfully resolved, this essentially creates an array of emails which we can return to the front end. And alongside with that, we're also returning our pagination parameters just in case. And this is how the get emails route works. This is the most complicated route out of all. So just to recap, we are getting a folder name, we're verifying that the folder exists, we're opening the folder, getting all of the messages in the folder, then we're getting only the messages that we do care about, we fetch the contents of those messages, and then we extract the contents of those messages, and we return the results to the front end. And with that said, let's move on to the next function, which is the move to folder function, which allows us to move emails from one folder to the other. The primary usage of this function right now is to move emails from our inbox to our trash folder. Now, when we delete an email, we first move it to the trash folder before we're deleting it from the trash folder permanently. So to move the email to the trash folder, we're using this route, and we're providing the ID of the email, the source folder, and the destination folder. Again, we're opening the inbox using the source folder, and then we're using imap.sequence.move to move the email in question using its ID to the destination folder. So basically this way we've successfully moved the email from one folder to another one. And with that said, the last route, which concerns the management of our emails, is the delete email route. And this route allows us to get the ID of the email in question, and then we're opening the trash inbox specifically, because this should only work with the trash inbox. And then what we do is we simply add the deleted flag to our email by using its ID, and then we simply say imap.expunge to remove all of the deleted emails from the currently open inbox. And with that, we are pretty much done with our email related routes. And now we have only 3 routes left, which have to do with our authentication. And the first one is logout, which simply calls the logout function from before, which terminates the IMAP connection and resets all of the objects. Then we have the login function, which pretty much does nothing. It exists simply for consistency, since authentication is done through the auth middleware, and that can be done through pretty much any route which utilizes that middleware. And lastly, we have the logged in route, which returns whether a user is logged in, and the simplest way to do it is to check whether the IMAP object is instantiated, because if it is, this means that there is an existing connection, so the user is logged in, and if not, this means that the user is logged out. So this is what we're doing. We're checking if the state is equal to authenticated, and then we're returning a positive response. Otherwise, we return an error. And this is pretty much how the backend works. Everything is very simplified, so do not use this in a commercial environment, but hopefully this illustrates how easy it is to start building your own email server. So on the client side of things, let's look at our web interface before we jump into the code and explain how everything is structured. So to begin with, we have a very simple login screen, and in here we can just simply click on login to log in with the Mercury user that matches our credentials. So we can click on login, and as you can see here, we have 2 emails. One is an auto-generated email, which is created when you start up Mercury, and then you also have an email reply which I received from another account of mine. So basically here we can see that I've received this email from Bob, and it is addressed to me, and here is the date. Now if we go to the previous email, if we scroll down, as you can see here, this is formatted because we're in HTML view, but we can also go into text view to view everything without formatting. So then we also have a delete button and a reply button, and clicking on the reply button, a nice editor appears down here, and we can use this editor to reply to the current email. So now if we go to this email, we can go ahead and we can reply to it, and let's enter a simple reply like hey, and now we can click send, and this successfully sends a reply. If I go into my sent folder, you will be able to see the reply in here. So as you can see, basically our backend works, and this is exactly how we have configured everything. And if we go back into our main mailbox, in here you will be able to see an eye icon, which you can use to mark your email as unread if you wish so, and then if you click on it, it will become read again. Now, having that said, if we try and delete this email, so if we press on delete, as you can see, it is removed from the main inbox and it is moved into the deleted folder. From here, I can either click on this button to move this email back into my inbox, so this will unarchive the email, and the error here is simply because this inbox is empty, so it is letting us know that this inbox doesn't have anything in it, and then I can go back in here and I can see my email again. Now, if I delete this email, so basically if I delete it again, if I go into the deleted folder, and if I delete it once more, this time it will be gone forever. So if I just click on delete, as you can see now it is gone. So having that said, one of the last features here is the ability to refresh your inbox, and then you can also compose a new email by clicking on the pencil icon. So let's address this to Bob. And as you can see, there is validation as well. So if I actually remove this, this tells me that this field is invalid. And then in here, let's add a subject. And for the text here, let's try using some formatting to see that everything works, including our HTML formatting. And with that, let's hit send. And the message was sent. And now we can log out from our account by clicking the logout button. And this terminates our connection with the server, with the IMAP server to be precise, as we saw in the server configuration section. And here I can just enter Bob, since the password is the same, and I can press on login. And as you can see, I have a bunch of email here, And if I click on these emails, you can see that this one was from February 4th, and these two are the two latest emails. And as you can see, the reply here is marked with RE, and then here this is a new email to which I can also reply. And we can send the reply by clicking on send. And then if we go to send, we can also see our own reply. We can also go to delete it and we can see here that we have a deleted email. And we also support pagination, but this is hard to show with less than 10 emails. So everything works perfectly, as you can see. And with that, let's go into the actual code and let's see how everything is implemented. So now let's take a look at the actual front-end implementation of our web client. And before we begin, I have to warn you that this project is implemented with Angular. And if you're not familiar with Angular, this might be a little bit confusing. And if you want to acquaint yourself with Angular, I do have an Angular crash course for beginners on my channel, so do check that out. And with that out of the way, let's get going. So let's begin with our services, which are essentially our controllers that allow us to interface with our backend. We will begin with our authentication service, and in here we have the login, logout, and logged in functions. Now the login function essentially stores the user's username and password from the parameters inside of our local storage. So basically, once the user logs in, we want to store the username and the password inside of our local storage to ensure that if they refresh the page by accident, the session is not lost. And then we simply make a GET request to our server on the login endpoint. Now, the logout function simply sets the username and the password to empty, and then we make a GET request to the logout endpoint. And then the logged in function makes a GET request to the logged in endpoint, and this endpoint essentially returns whether the user is logged in or not. Now, I will explain how exactly we pass the username and the password into those requests, since here we're simply making these requests without passing anything in. So I'm gonna be explaining how we do that in just a second. But before we do that, let's take a look up here. So inside of our constructor, once the service is initialized, we're checking whether a username and password are present in the local storage, and if they are, we're fetching the username and the password, and we're setting the state as logged in. So essentially, this is an initial step which we want to take once the user refreshes the browser to retain the user's session. Now, in another place inside this project, we're also checking whether the user is truly logged in by contacting the backend. Now, having that said, let's move on to the email service. And inside of our email service, we have a couple of functions which all interface with our backend to manipulate our mailboxes. Now, every single one of these functions have a corresponding function on the backend, which we've discussed previously, but I'm gonna go over them briefly. First of all, we have the getEmails function, and this function takes in as parameters our pagination parameters and the name of our inbox. Then we contact the corresponding endpoint and we pass in our pagination parameters. And then we have the compose email function, which takes in the subject, the message, and the recipient. And again, we are essentially making a post request to the corresponding endpoint with the email object. Then, in a similar fashion, we have the sendReply function, which sends a reply with a specific text to a specific message. So basically, the ID here is the ID of a specific email message. And then, in a similar fashion, we have the sendReply function, which takes in as parameters the text of the reply and the ID of the email that we're replying to. Then we have the moveToFolder function, which again requires the ID of the email, the source folder, and the destination folder. Then we have the deleteEmail function, which simply requires the ID of the email, the markAsRead function, and the markAsUnread function, which also require the ID of the email. So these are very simple functions. They are simply contacting our backend and basically providing the corresponding parameters to our backend functions. Now, having that said, let's take a look at how exactly we're authenticating in the first place, because at the moment we're simply making requests to the backend with none or very few parameters. Now, in Angular, there is this concept of interceptors, and interceptors allow you to intercept outgoing and incoming requests and basically forge new requests from them. So the way this works is that here we have an interceptors folder, and here we have an authentication interceptor and an API interceptor. The API interceptor simply displays an error message if something goes wrong, so we don't really care about that, but the authentication interceptor does something a little bit more useful. Now, the authentication interceptor here, it simply gets the username and the password from our authentication service from before, so basically it gets those two variables, and then it creates a copy of our request and sets the authorization header to the encoded version of our username and password in this format. And this is how we send our credentials to the backend. Now, having that said, let's also look at the actual structure of the UI. So basically, if we move here, if we move into our UI, we will see that we have our main mailbox view, and then we also have our login page. So if I log out, as you can see here, we have our login page, and if I log in, I can actually see my mail view. Now, the mail view itself is separated into 3 columns, so we divide it into 3 sections: the folders, the emails, and the mail body. Now, if we move back into our code here, if we go into our HTML app component file, you will see that it is divided into 2 sections: the login view and the mailbox view. Now, the login view is simply the login page that triggers a login function. The mailbox view, again, is deleted into 3 sections. So these are the aforementioned sections. So we have our folders, our messages, and our message view. Now, for the folders, again, we have 3 buttons, and on each one of those, we just call the get emails function with the name of the corresponding inbox. Now, if we move into the next section, which is the messages column, you will see that here we retrieve all of our emails, and then if we click on one of these emails, we call the select email function. So basically, this is our messages column, and then we can move on to the next section, which is our messages view, and in here we have our header. So basically, this section up here, we have our header, and then we have our message body. So basically, here is our message body with our buttons down here. And for our message body, we have the actual message, and then we have the footer buttons. Now, the footer buttons comprise of the toggle down here. So this is our select button, so we can toggle between HTML and text. Then we have our delete button, and then we have our reply button. So as you can see here, this is our toggle, this is our delete button, and this is our reply button. Now, if we're already replying, we want to show our editor, and again, another button which allows us to hide the reply or send it. So again, if I just click on reply, as you can see, this is the editor, and this is the send button alongside with the cancel button. So basically, this is our entire application. It's pretty simple. And beyond that, the only other thing we have is the compose email pop-up up here, which is located inside of our pop-ups folder. And in here, as you can see, this is the HTML. And again, we have 2 buttons, send and cancel, inside of our footer. Then up here, we have an input field which matches the receiver, the subject, and then we also have our editor. So this is our form. And in here, when we want to send something, we call the send function. And if we want to cancel and hide the form, we call the cancel function. So now let's briefly take a look at the corresponding TypeScript files which contain the associated functions. So for our compose file here, we have a corresponding .cs file. And in here, as you can see, we have 2 functions, send and cancel. So cancel simply hides the window, while send calls the submit function and then hides the window. Now, the submit function is imported up here. So basically inside of our constructor, we're importing the form, and the form basically contains these three fields, and it is used for validation to ensure that our inputs are correct. So basically, unless our inputs are correct, we don't allow the user to send the email. And we're using a form for that. And then we're also passing the submit function in here. And then once we click on send, this function is triggered. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at our application.component.cs file, and you will see how we pass those in. So going into that file, in here, as you can see, this is a little bit more complicated, but again, this is pretty straightforward. So here we have our services, which we're using, so we're importing them inside of our constructor. Then we have a bunch of icons and a bunch of variables that we're using here. But what we care about is, if we scroll down here, we have our login form. So this is one of our forms, and the login form simply contains the username and the password. And these are the validators which we're using to ensure that these fields are not empty. And then if we scroll down here, we have an authenticate function which contacts the authenticate service to get the logged in state and set it to true. We set show login to false to hide the login screen, and then we fetch the name of the user from the authentication service, and we do that simply because we want to show it up here. And then we have the ngOnInit function, which is called once the component has been created, and in here we want to check if the user has been logged in. And remember, if we go into our authentication service, so if we go in here, then we set logged in to true if we have a username and a password stored inside of our local storage. So going back here, as you can see, we check whether logged in is actually true. So we say logged in.value here. And basically, if you take a look up here, you will see that the logged in variable inherits from our logged in service. So basically, it inherits this value. So if we find a username and a password inside of our local storage, then this is true. And if so, we want to ensure that the user is also logged in on the server. So basically, for example, if the user's session expires and then they refresh the browser and they still have a username and a password in the local storage, we want to log them out because essentially this means that their session has expired. Otherwise, we want to keep them logged in. And to do that, as you can see here, we have a next and an error, two functions, and we check if the user is logged in, again by contacting the authentication service and calling the corresponding function. And if so, we call the authenticate function. Otherwise, we remove the username and password from the local storage, and then we say that the user is no longer logged in. So having that said, the next function is login, which simply logs out the user in any case. So if we are calling the login function, this means that anyhow the user should be logged out first. So we log out the user, and this also terminates the session on the server. And then we call the login function, and again we call the authenticate function to log in the user properly. Otherwise, we set logged in to false. So in the case of a logout, we simply log out the user, and then we reset every single variable that we need to reset. And then again, we show the login screen and set logged in to false. Then we have a toggle reply and reset reply and reset all functions here, which we use in our UI, and I'm not going to be going over them since they're specific to this Angular project. Then we have a mark as unread function, which essentially allows us to mark an email as unread by calling the corresponding service again. We have a mark as read function, which does the same. We have a select email function, which essentially allows us to select a specific email. So basically, when we click on an email, we want to set that email as selected, and this is exactly what we do. We set this email as selected, and we also mark the email as read if it hasn't been marked as read already. So basically, when we click on an email, we want to ensure that it is marked as read. So when we reload the page, we won't have to view the email again. And then we also have a refresh emails function here, which resets the pagination and loading parameters and then gets all of the emails once again. So this is this button up here. So moving on, we have the email form, And this is the form that we are passing inside of our compose here. So we have it to a subject and the email itself. So basically we're gonna be passing this form inside of our compose here, and this is the contents alongside with our validators. And as you can see here, we also have an email validator, which allows us to basically ensure that this is an email, and unless I input a valid email, this is highlighted in red. So as you can see, if the email is invalid, this is going to be highlighted in red. So having that said, let's move on. Again, this is the function which simply toggles the compose window here. And when we toggle that window, we can pass in our form, which is our email form, and a submit function to our compose. So this is what we saw before. Here we're simply fetching what we passed in. So again, if we move back here, you will see that here I have a dedicated function called compose email, and that function essentially calls the compose email function inside of our email service to send a new email. And then it displays the corresponding success or error messages. Then we have a pagination function, which allows us to change between pages, and then once we do that, we get the emails again. We have a send reply function, which allows us to essentially send a reply. So basically, when we click on an email and we click reply and then we click on send, this function allows us to send that reply by providing the reply and the ID of the selected email and calling the corresponding service function. Now here we have the function to remove an email from trash by calling again the corresponding service function. We also have a function to move the email to trash, and then we have a function to completely delete an email, but this only works if the email is already located inside of the trash folder. So then we have the get emails function, which simply applies our pagination parameters. It waits for 500 milliseconds to allow the loader to show for at least that amount of time, otherwise it's going to be simply flickering. And then once this is done, we're setting loading to false to show our emails, and then basically we are getting our emails from our response. So basically, if the response is a success, we're getting our emails, and we're getting our total pages and total messages, which allows us to show a correct pagination down here. Otherwise, we are setting our emails to empty. With that, we're pretty much done with our front-end web client. So basically everything is pretty simple. We simply have our services to communicate with our backend, and then we have two components, the compose component, which is our compose pop-up, and the app component, which contains the majority of our UI. The heavy lifting is done by the backend, and the frontend simply calls the corresponding functions to interface with our backend server. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope you've learned something new. This is a new channel and I'm experimenting with content, so if you want longer and more detailed videos, or if you want shorter content, do let me know in the comments below and I will make sure to adjust my content accordingly. With that said, thank you so much to all of my new subscribers. This is a new channel and every single like and subscription counts. So again, thank you so much and I'll see you in the next one.